QSO Today, episode 505, Rex Moncur, VK7MO. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. This week, I want to thank Thomas White, 86TW, who is a regular monthly sponsor. Thanks, Thomas. And a new yearly supporter, Marion Sabo, C6ACH, who became a listener sponsor for $100 yearly. There were additional anonymous sponsors this week, and I want to thank them for their support. The cost of hosting and managing over 500 videos on Vimeo, always available to anyone, and the other expenses associated with QSO Today project is expensive. Please help me keep it all together financially without commercial sponsors by becoming a listener sponsor monthly or annually, by making a cash donation for any amount, make it reoccurring please, or by using our affiliate links to QRP Labs, Amazon, and now Radio Oddity, where they give us a small percentage of what you buy. This support keeps it going after over 500 episodes of QSO Today. I will try removing the mid-roll appeal from now on if you can support QSO Today. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur callsign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Just a reminder that the response to my amateur radio events calendar has been great. You can get to it from the banner link on the show notes page. This calendar is updated by you, and I hope that it will be the most comprehensive amateur radio events calendar on the internet. Please use it and update it with your ham radio events. If you are new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have over 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on links that take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos hosted on Vimeo on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. Rex Moncur, VK7MO, holds the world record for the longest 10 GHz EME contact using a 50-watt transmitter to a 70-centimeter satellite TV dish. Since his retirement over 20 years ago, Rex has garnered expertise, contacts, and equipment for operating VHF and above for EME, meteor scatter, rain scatter, lightning scatter, aircraft scatter from his modest home in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. VK7MO tells his ham radio story and his microwave exploits in this QSO Today. VK7MO, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Rex?
4Z1UG, this is VK7 Mike Oscar in Hobart, Tasmania.
Welcome to the QSO Today podcast, Rex. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it primarily started with my dad, and I just need to give you a little bit of background to him. He got his call sign in 1930, and he did some really clever stuff with mechanical television in the 1930s and electronic television in 1949 before television came to Australia. And about this time I was, just 7 or 10-year-old. He used to take me and my brothers out to field days on transmitter hunts, fox hunts. That's where my interest in ham radio started.
It was just part of a genetic thing.
I think it was exposure. Because my mum was trying to be part of all this, and she used to write an article in our amateur radio magazine, which is like our equivalent of QST. And she, for a couple of years, she wrote articles called the YL Corner. So the whole family was into it. One of my brothers got a call sign. but he didn't really take it up to any great extent.
Was your mother a ham as well?
No,
She was just the YL.
yeah. The problem was in those days there was only one level of call sign, and it was fairly technical. It's the same as our advanced level now, and it wasn't a sort of a multi-choice thing. You actually had to write essays about how you neutralize the triode and do all these things. And she couldn't do that. She was good on the Morse, but she never got the technical stuff.
What was the hometown?
The hometown was Melbourne, which is actually on the mainland of Australia.
Okay, and you're actually talking to me from Hobart, Tasmania.
Yes.
So your QTH now is Hobart, Tasmania.
Yes.
So what happened after that? You got this interest in amateur radio because your father's schlepping you all over the place and sharing with you his ham radio life. How did you become involved, and when was that?
Well, my father was a tailor, and I was supposed to be, being the oldest son, I was supposed to go into the tailoring business. And I worked over school holidays in the shop selling things. And at about 12 years old, some guy said, "You wrap that parcel like a wet dish mop." And I got so upset that I ran in and talked to my mum and said, "I am never going to work in the shop all my life." My dad said, "Well, what are you going to do with yourself?" I said, "I'm going to fix radios." Anyway, he talked to one of his handmates, and his handmate said, "Don't let him do a technician course. Make sure he does engineering." And so that ham, it was VK3ZAA, did me a great service.
So he advised your father that you should go into engineering. And what did you do? Did you go to engineering school?
I went to the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology and did communication engineering. And that led to a job in the Bureau of Meteorology, looking after development and procurement of telemetry systems as an engineer. That was a lot of fun. It was a bit like ham radio.
Well, yeah, I would think so. And with a country the size of Australia and with as much outback, people should know Australian geography, but all of the Australians live around the coasts of Australia, and the huge center of Australia is largely rural. It seems to me that telemetry systems and radio in a place like Australia would be a fantastic opportunity to play with gear.
Absolutely, yes. And including, at one stage, we were even involved with rocket sondes, sending radio sondes up with rockets to measure the upper atmosphere. We never continued with it, but it was fun to go and do it.
Well, it seems to me that rocket sondes would be more expensive than balloon sondes.
Much more expensive. In the 1960s, they were something like $150,000 a flight, compared to a balloon sonde that in the 60s it was probably about $30.
Latex balloon with a transponder on it.
But the balloon stuff has proved to be very useful to my later work in tropoducting and things. So my knowledge that I gained there, I've applied to a lot of the papers I've written on ducting and things.
So we're going to talk about the interest that you have in microwave. But when you first became a ham, did you have other interests in ham radio? Like, were you an HF operator, and did you have favorite modes then? Or did you kind of go straight to VHF, UHF?
I first got my license when I was 18, which was the earliest you were allowed to have a license in those days. It's not the case anymore. And the license I got was called a limited license, which didn't require CW, but limited you to VHF and above. That meant my first interest was VHF, 2 meters actually, and I've stayed with VHF and above ever since. I did get a HF license with CW a couple of years later, but never really was a fan of HF.
Well, I saw in one of your pictures you have an IC 7300, or is that a 9700?
Yeah, 9100. which is a HF radio as well as VHF.
9100, okay.
That does HF as well as right up to 1296. I've got a couple of 9700s, which is what I primarily use.
So do you think, Rex, that what sparked your interest in operating microwave was because you were limited to VHF and above?
I'm sure that's right, yes.
And did you find that when you started operating in the higher frequencies that there were some unique challenges?
Well, there was certainly excitement because where I was in Melbourne at the time, you could occasionally get ducks across to Tasmania, for instance, and they were very exciting. I guess I really enjoyed it.
So why did you end up in Tasmania? When I first was researching you and I looked you up and I sent you the invitation, wow, first of all, he's on an island, Tasmania, south of Australia. He's in Hobart. Who can you work on microwave from Tasmania? And so I thought that is a very unique challenge.
Yeah.
How did you end up in Tasmania? And given the volume of your work on microwave and above, that there's a lot to do from Tasmania on microwave.
Well, I'll tell you how I got there. First of all, I worked for our Bureau of Meteorology as an engineer for 11 years. And at one stage, we were put into a new department called the Department of Science. And they wanted people to go to Canberra and work in the Department of Science. This was mainly administrative work, but it brought me across a lot of different things. For instance, I was secretary of the Australian Research Grants Committee that funds all research at Australian universities. I was the liaison officer for the Ionospheric Prediction Service in Canberra, involved in setting up the Solar Observatory with the US Air Force. But then I actually did a lot of other things like industrial relations and finance and personnel management and stuff like that. After a while, I was offered the job in Hobart of running, or initially as deputy of the Australian Antarctic Division.
You said that when you originally were working for the Department of Science in Australia, that you joined the Australian Antarctic Division. Does that mean that is Tasmania considered Antarctic?
No, but the home base for the Australian Antarctic program is in Hobart, or just south of Hobart. And we look after Australia's Antarctic territory, which is almost as big as the rest of Australia except Queensland. So it's an enormous territory, mostly ice with an average depth of 1.5 kilometres. But running that program consumed all my days, and I didn't do any ham radio when I was doing it.
Does Australia have Antarctic bases?
Yes, we have 3 bases within our territory in Antarctica and one on subantarctic Macquarie Island, about halfway down there.
And did you ever have a chance to go to those bases when you were working in that division?
Well, I say I went there 6.5 times because I got halfway there and the main drive gear on the ship split in half, and then we had to struggle back.
So did they have to use like an icebreaker in order to get to these bases, or were there harbors, natural harbors, in order to be able to get close enough to be able to get to them?
There's different definitions of an icebreaker, but we were always using an ice-capable vessel. But one of my jobs was introducing a real icebreaker to work in Antarctica, and that would break about 1.2 metres of ice, providing it wasn't under pressure. If the wind is blowing towards the shore and the ice is under pressure, it's a lot more difficult.
You said you weren't active during that period of time, but were there amateur radio stations from those Australian Antarctic stations?
There were. I must admit, I was not keen on amateurs operating at our stations because they had other jobs to do. While my wife wasn't keen at first, she said, if you really want to go, we'll go. And that got me to Tasmania. I should say, since I left Melbourne, I wasn't really active in amateur radio, other than I used to keep in touch with my dad on 40 metres, who could talk to his grandchildren. So I didn't get active again in Tasmania until 1998 when I retired. I didn't think I would get involved in ham radio again, but my wife, who had originally used to go out with me on field days when she was only 16, said, oh, you'll get back into it. You will enjoy it. Unfortunately, she passed away just after I retired. And I went and saw another friend in Adelaide who'd become a ham, and he had this tiny little radio, FT847, which seemed to do everything. And I thought, I think I can give this a go. And that's where I got back into ham radio in Hobart. Now, I was still interested in VHF. The problem with Hobart, it's in a river valley, and it's on the south side of Tasmania, and there's mountains all between to the north. And everybody told me, you can't you can't get out of Hobart on VHF.
Nice challenge.
Yes. They said, look, there's a guy up in the north of Tasmania is interested in VHF. Talk to him. And his name was Joe Gelston. He was a really good guy, and we started working each other over the mountains on 2 metres. Ultimately, I was starting to do aircraft scatter on 2 metres up to the mainland, getting out of Hobart on 2 metres. So that's the short answer to that.
When you do aircraft scatter, are you operating like lots of power in order to be able to do that, or are you just doing that with the FT847?
Initially just with the F847, but I do have a Tokyo high power linear now. However, we're limited to 120 watts on digital mode, so there's some limitations. We can do 400 on SSB, but only 120 watts on digital.
What is the digital mode that you would run for aircraft scatter?
Well, initially I ran Hellschreiber. And then I was talking to, I can't remember his call sign, an American, who got a Romanian student to write a little program that could exchange call signs. And we were starting to do that. And then he said to me, there's a guy here who reckons he can make a much better program. And, well, to be fair, he said he would be able to make a much better program. And I sort of rolled my eyes, and it turned out it was Joe Taylor. And and so I got involved with Joe Taylor right from the start when he first introduced FSK 441. And, of course, I've been with all of the various digital modes that Joe Taylor's developed ever since.
If you're doing aircraft scatter now, what mode would you operate in?
I'd used Q65, and I've used it quite effectively at 10 gigs from here to the mainland, about 500 kilometres to 600 kilometres, yes.
And with aircraft scatter, how long is the QSO?
Well, the actual scatter is not very long, but you can typically get little bursts of 5 to 10 seconds. Some periods you don't get anything. And what we found the best thing is to use Q65 in 15-second periods. And that way you can typically complete a QSO when an aircraft is there in about 5 minutes. But you've got to wait for an aircraft to be there.
That's an interesting thing, Rex. If you look at the major airports, I would think that Sydney or Melbourne would be like this. There's an aircraft coming in on the descent like every 5 minutes.
Yes, but unfortunately, Hobart doesn't have anything like that number of aircraft. But between Sydney and Melbourne, I sent you a picture of aircraft scattered. And what I did there is I actually just got a guy to transmit a constant tone. And I was about halfway between Sydney and Melbourne and looking at the Doppler shift for all the aircraft flying up and down. And you'll see funny curved paths as they dive off the main path into Canberra. Or we have in our radio club a couple of ladies who are into radio art. And I gave them this picture and they were wrapped in it as a bit of radio art.
By the way, congratulations. You set the 10 gigahertz Earth-Moon-Earth EME world record. Can you share the story behind this achievement and what it took to make this work for you?
Essentially, I started doing EME initially with just 10 watts on 10 gigs, 60 centimetre dish, with a couple of big stations.
So that's a TV dish, right?
Yes, a little offset TV dish. I started to get the idea that I could do this better if I could go up to 50 watts and up to a prime focus dish, which made it easier to point the thing properly at the moon. And I was working quite a few stations, just going portable and opening up grid squares around Australia. And one of the times I went right over to Western Australia where I thought I could extend the existing 10 gig world record. And I took my 10 watt system over there and set up a ham over there with it and went round doing grid squares with him and training him how to do it. Once I got him set up, I came back to Tasmania. Initially, we then had to wait for a duct, so we were watching both the Hepburn charts and the Radiosonde data. And ultimately, there was a time when it looked like it would happen. So I had to travel up to the north coast of Tasmania. While I was travelling up there, he kept ringing me up and said, he's ready, get on the air, because the opening's on 2 metres across to Victoria. But where I had to go was a very rough dirt road and I couldn't hurry up. Finally, I got up there, and as soon as I turned on, I could see his carry, because the way we normally line up on 10 gigs, we send a single tone first, which puts all the energy in one spot that you can watch on your waterfall. Fairly soon after that, we completed a QSO, which extended the then world record only by 32 kilometres, but it had been planned that way. A bit later, we completed on voice. The following year, we extended it about another 60 kilometres, but only on digital that time. My view is that path probably only opens up over that distance once every couple of years. So if both stations are going to go portable and set up, it's not as if you can just monitor from your home all the time. That was the 10 gig terrestrial world record, yes.
That was from Western Australia, and the destination, the other station, was where?
I was back in Tasmania, but on the north coast of Tasmania. So, because from Hobart, you never get out of Hobart on a duct because the mountains all around Hobart would prevent it. So a place called Cape Portland, where other than a few wind generators, there's nothing else. But the wind generators proved very good for lining up bearings and knowing I was pointing in the right place.
And you did that with your low power station, 10 watts.
Well, I had a 50-watt station in Tasmania, but my friend in Western Australia had my 10-watt station. He had my 10-watt station and a 60-centimetre dish, I had my 50 watts and a 77 centimeter dish.
Now, oftentimes when we think of EME, and maybe it was in the time before the digital modes, an EME array was multiple dishes or multiple Yagi antennas on pan tilt tripods running 500 watts, 1,000 watts. Is it because of the digital modes that you're actually able to create portable EME stations that you can operate on a less than a meter dish?
It's a combination of going up to high frequencies where you get, if you were 2 meters, you would still need a large Yagi because you can't get that much gain out of a 60 centimeter or a 77 centimeter dish as you can at 10 gigs. So it's a combination of being on a high frequency and the digital modes, particularly Q65, which Joe has developed in a way where even though the tone spacing might be only 20 hertz, the signal off the moon at 10 gigs might be spread 250 hertz and it can still decode it. The problem of going up in frequency is you get massive Doppler shift, like up to 30 kilohertz, plus or minus 30 kilohertz at 10 gigs, combined with the fact that even though, because the moon's not a point source, you have a different Doppler shift from one side of the moon to the other, and that spreads the signal. And that's why you get a signal that's spread by 250 hertz, and yet the latest mode that Joe's developed copes with it.
Now, at this point, I would be asking this question if I was listening to this podcast, and that is, here you are, you're in Hobart, Tasmania, you have a new interest in microwave and EME. What kind of equipment and expertise did you have to develop in order to build your own microwave transceivers? And I've got pictures, which I'll put on the show notes page, of some of the projects that you've done, which we'll talk about. But what did you have to do to build your skill set and test equipment and shop skills in order to be able to do this?
Well, in terms of the basic equipment, such as transverters that bring you down to 2 meters and the 9700 and amplifiers, I've always purchased those. DB6NT produces really good stuff, but you do have to develop a whole lot of mechanical stuff to track the moon, have it all so it works portable. GPS locking is essential to keep yourself on frequency. And Joe and I wrote a paper on GPS locking and Doppler shift because I started developing Doppler shift techniques separately. And so the skill is more in the hardware, in terms of physical hardware, tracking systems, and the software. And you don't do these things on your own, but if you encourage other people to help you, you can put all these results together. And as a result of what I've learned, there's another station in Tasmania who is well set up on 10 gigs EME and working lots of stations. He's got a better takeoff to Europe than me. I've got a better takeoff to North America, across that nice view, across the water. So putting all these things together, it's not cheap to purchase the basic equipment that you need, and then putting everything else together and learning everything, you get a lot of joy out of it.
Well, it also appears to me that you've got a fair amount of test equipment, microwave test equipment, signal generator, spectrum analyzer, things like that you've acquired over time?
Yes, mainly very old stuff, HP equipment that's 40 or 50 years old, but good stuff that still works.
Right, and it was $100,000 in the olden days.
Probably, yes, and I think I might have paid $800, 18 gig signal generator, yeah.
And you found that the internet, of course, has kind of opened the world to finding and collecting expertise in areas where you actually need some tutoring in order to be successful?
Sure. Reading articles in various amateur radio magazines. Dubus, I find, is terrific. I don't know whether you know Dubus. It's a German magazine for VHF and above, and they publish it in both English and German. And I've probably maybe 30 or 40 articles I've put in it in the last 10 or 15 years, and that's a good way of learning.
You sent me a picture of your high-power 474 terahertz transmitter.
Yes.
Now, what is that? What band is that? And how do you operate it?
Essentially, I feed WSJT in and square it off as a square wave and turn the LEDs on and off at the audio rate of WSJT. I probably have, because I use a square wave, I've probably got harmonics all over the band, but there's not many people complain about 474 terahertz. It's actually red light. And using that, I got from Tasmania across to the mainland only one way, because I only built one receiver and one transmitter. And I scattered off cirrus clouds. I used an avalanche photodiode for the receiver and a 400mm Fresnel lens. I do have a 1 square meter Fresnel lens that I might finish up using to extend it. So in a way, it's only old-fashioned AM.
How many miles is that path?
It was 288 kilometers.
288 kilometers, wow. And that's with red light.
Yes.
Did you write a paper on this, or have you done any YouTube videos?
Well, I've got 3 papers in Dubus back in about 2011, or maybe 4 papers in different volumes where we discussed the theory and the receivers, the transmitters, and the results. I haven't done a lot of that since, but that new transmitter that I'm working on should have about another, I forget how much, but a useful amount of extra power. One of the interesting things about optical is that the receiver is a current receiver, not a power receiver. And that means if you can double the power, you actually get 4 times the current. And so the signal-to-noise ratio improves 6 dB every time you double the power.
I know of some guys in the Bay Area who use the LiDAR detectors on the back of the bumper of new cars. That is a part to do like a 23-mile QSO.
Yeah, at about 122 gigs. We're talking 474 tetrahertz.
It's mind-blowing, especially considering the path that you were able to establish from one place to the other. You alluded earlier to you were working 10 gigahertz grid squares, and I kind of think that's quite interesting. What was that project, and how did you execute it?
Well, when I had my 50-watt amplifier and 77-centimeter dish, I could work nearly all the stations on 10 gigs. As long as they had at least 50 watts and about a 1.8 meter dish, I could work them. I went out activating different grid squares.
Across Australia?
Around Australia. Then I activated a few more, driving across to Western Australia to set up the 10 gig record. And I was getting to the point where I thought I was within reach of giving OK1KAR 100 grid squares on 10 gigs. And so over a couple of years, I went out to more and more grid squares around Australia and worked him. I was also working W5LUA in Texas, and gradually a number of stations, I think, it did vary from time to time, but up to about 10 stations would come on every time I operated from a new grid, and I'd give them all a new grid around Australia.
You said you operate around the coast, but could you go into the center of the country like Alice Springs and have that kind of success as well on EME?
I did go up through the centre, past Alice Springs. It's a bit of a problem to go off because there's a decent highway up the centre to Alice Springs. But if you go off in either side of that, you finish up in desert areas, sand dunes, and on your own, it's not very sensible if you get bogged and you haven't got any help.
It is a desert, after all.
That's right, yes.
So in terms of operating 10 gigahertz EME, it didn't really matter where in the country you were in order to make these 5 or 10 contacts from each grid square.
No.
When I hear 10 gigahertz, I keep thinking, oh, well, line of sight. There's no operators. Who would you operate? But when you think about EME, then the world's your oyster, it seems to me.
That's right. I mean, because I did a lot of, initially on 1296, I did EME and then 2.4 from home here in Hobart. And then a lot of the 10 gig stuff I did from home initially. And ultimately I went up to 24 gigs and did EME. And I got the world record on that too.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. Are there any unique technical innovations that you've made to your 10 gigahertz, 24 gigahertz rigs that enhanced your microwave success?
Not really the rigs, other than optimizing everything. Other than that, it's all been in software that really Joe Taylor's done the work.
How has the amateur radio community in Tasmania and beyond supported your endeavors? And what role does collaboration with other hams play in the success of your operations?
There really is nobody else in Tasmania that I can rely on for this sort of work. But I have encouraged a few others who are now into it. And we all talk about things together. We've got a very active radio club, and I've sent you some of the videos that our radio club produces. They essentially produce a video every week, which goes out on TV and goes out on YouTube. I guess just having when you make an achievement, you got people to say, "Oh, that's good." Yes.
And the availability, I'm assuming with the availability of hams and the ham club, does getting equipment for your projects, does it make it relatively easier in Hobart than it would be, well, wouldn't be easier than, say, on the mainland, but the relative availability of supplies, of hardware, of things that you need in order to construct your equipment, do you have ready availability there?
I wouldn't say readily available, but for instance, the 10 gigs dishes that I'm using, and I use a 77, 1.2, and my friend who's now into it is using a 1.8. We got them all for free from the microwave links used by the Hydroelectric Authority in Tasmania, who used to operate all their generators and link them up by microwaves, and then they needed more bandwidth and got rid of these dishes, and that was terrific.
They went to fiber or something like that?
No, they just went from... they put these things in probably in about 1990. About 2010, they wanted much more bandwidth, and so they went to a more modern system.
Do you have any future projects on your workbench right now, and perhaps some new goals that you want to achieve?
I'd have to say I'm slowing down. I'm not sure where I'm going to put my effort. I think I generally now want to do things from home rather than going portable all around the country on my own. I've been doing things like a rural scatter, a digital rural scatter, and digital on lightning scatter. And I've got an article in this volume of Dubis that just came out on lightning scatter, which, as far as I can tell, is the first time there's ever been a QSO on lightning scatter. And in this case, that was at 1296.
People would think that, lightning strikes, but there must be, some residual ionization in the air that hangs after the lightning that allows you to make the contact?
Yes, it hangs around for about 0.2 of a second at the most.
So briefly, how does it work then?
Well, I don't know whether you're familiar with the meteor scatter mode that Joe has called MS144. Now, that mode can actually get two call signs and a report through in 70 milliseconds. When we found this out fortuitously. I was working a guy in the mainland on Q65, and we started hearing these little bursts of strong signals like meteors at 1296. Well, meteors don't work at 1296. And so we changed over to MSK 144, and this was during a tremendous lightning storm. There was some 500,000 homes in Victoria were all knocked out of electricity, and probably something that will never happen again. And we thought we'd completed 3 QSOs, but when we looked at them carefully, only one QSO was actually completed on lightning. The others had some aircraft scatter involved as well. But that's a new mode of propagation.
It sounds amazing. And it sounds like it requires probably somebody with your experience on all the other things in order to be successful, at least at first.
I think that's right.
What advice would you give for newcomers that might want to be interested in working VHF and above, especially if you're talking 10 gigahertz, 24 gigahertz and above?
Well, I'd have to say that to do the sort of things I'm doing, you have to spend a fair bit of money on the equipment. And unless someone's in a position to do that, I wouldn't encourage them to just jump into 10 and 24 gigs. The problem in Hobart is very, very few of the newcomers finish up doing much more than working on repeaters and local VHF. So there's a fair gap between that and what I'm involved in. But we have had, there's 4 stations who are on 10 gigs in Hobart.
Are they engineering trained, or are they older? I mean, what's the demographic of those 4?
Well, one's an ex-American who's migrated here. He says he's an entrepreneur. He sells honey, a special sort of honey, got antibiotics in it or something. Another's a geologist. And the guy who does the best on EME, he's a welder, but he's very skilled at welding aluminium. And whenever I want brackets and things put together for my 10 gig system, he does a beautiful job. So we sort of help each other.
Yeah, I actually have a very good friend around the corner that is a specialist in welding aluminum. It's a good thing to know. It's a good resource to have. So if you were advising someone then to kind of start working their way towards, like you, towards EME, would you have them start in the lower frequencies like 432, 1296 and kind of build their skills over time in order to be able to gain this expertise?
Well, I can give you an example. In fact, I only just recently sent you an email with a picture of a 1296 meg Yagi, which you probably have a chance to look at.
I saw it, yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
And a drilling guide that you have.
That's right. Now, what I did there is I started off working a few people locally on 1296 by reflecting off a large mountain that we've got here. Gradually, people would ask questions, and I said, look, I'll run a workshop so you can build a Yagi that will do this. And I made the drilling rig jig for it and had people come around. And the first time, about 10 people came around and made Yagis, and they got on the air, and then more people wanted, and we ran another workshop, and then more, and another workshop. And the reality is we've got, well, I run a 1296 meg QSO party every Sunday morning, and we typically get about 15 stations on in Hobart. We've got 43 stations who are now operational on 1296 in Hobart. And for a city of 250,000, I don't think there'd be too many cities in the world that can have 43 stations on 1296. And the big advantage of this mountain is everybody can just point at the mountain and you don't have to turn your beam. And so you can have a QSO party with 15 stations on and everybody can hear everybody else. That's been a way of introducing hams to microwaves. Now, they're still going to have a system that will generate some power at, well, not significant power, but at 1296, there's a lot of IC9700s around that produce 10 watts at 1296. And many of them are using these Bulgarian transverters that produce 2 watts at 1296. That's been a way of introducing people to microwaves.
What comes to mind is I've got an SDR, for all intents and purposes, it's test equipment, but I'm going to use it for the QO100 satellite. So it goes up to 3 gigahertz transmit receive, software defined, but it sounds to me that with a 1296 amplifier, although I don't think I can operate 1296 in Israel, but it seems to me that you could probably use a software SDR system as well to create a transceiver on 1296 for your QSO party. Are you saying that most of the people that are doing this project are using 9700s, or they're using the transverter down to their HF rig?
Yeah, I'd say about a third are using 9700s. Most of the rest would be using these Bulgarian transverters. They're not very expensive, but you get them here for about $250 Australian dollars, which only about 170 US dollars.
All right, that's not too bad. So what drove this, Rex? Was it the building the antenna? Did the antenna come before people acquired the equipment?
Well, you can't really do anything unless you've got both.
Was it the cart before the horse? You obviously led this by creating a project like this, and for people to become part of your QSO party, they built an antenna and they acquired equipment.
Well, some of them had the equipment first, and some of them, once they built the antenna, went and bought the equipment. I'm not sure what the order was, but...
What mode do you use for your QSO party?
We use FM because A lot of the stations are not GPS locked. You can be very tolerant of frequency errors with FM at 1296.
It was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation. I really appreciate the effort that you took in order for us to have the conversation. Take care. Thank you so much.
Bye.
73. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Rex. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VK7MO in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.